Open your mind. Let the conversation begin.
We are the Mind Lounge podcast. Welcome. And today our mission is to unravel a mystery that is basically hiding in plain sight.
It really is. It's something most people interact with every single day without realizing it.
Exactly. We have this massive, just incredibly dense stack of sources sitting in front of us today. I mean, we are looking at hard data on the entire landscape of American exports.
Right.
And we've also got these deep historical analyses of, a highly secretive 1974 geopolitical agreement, plus some deeply complex academic frameworks about American military interventions.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah.
But the goal for this deep dive is to really connect the dots between those seemingly separate worlds.
Yeah, we're going to trace the invisible line between what America sells to the rest of the planet, the secret financial agreements that kind of shape the foundations of global power, and the really complex, often completely hidden reasons behind global conflicts.
Which is fascinating because we usually treat those things as totally separate.
Right. So to start, I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are holding a receipt. But, this isn't a receipt from your local grocery store or a coffee shop.
No, this is much bigger.
Yeah. Imagine you are holding an itemized receipt for the entire global economy. Every single transaction, every barrel of oil shipped across an ocean, every cargo plane loaded with microchips.
Every international exchange of goods and services.
Exactly. It is an infinitely long piece of paper trailing all the way out your front door, down the street, and just over the horizon. Now, if you look at the very top of that receipt, at the biggest, most influential export on that list, what do you think it is?
I think most of us would probably picture massive container ships stacked with physical cargo.
Right, like steel, grain, maybe weapons.
Yeah.
But the item at the very top of the list isn't a physical object at all. It is entirely invisible.
And to understand almost everything about modern global events, you really have to understand that invisible item.
You really do.
Because if you want to know why certain lines are drawn on maps, or why seemingly illogical alliances are formed, or even why conflicts erupt in specific regions at specific times, you have to look past the physical cargo.
You have to be willing to question, our most basic assumptions about how global power actually functions day to day.
Yeah, and how the architecture of global finance literally dictates the reality we all live in.
Mm-hmm.
We so often treat economics and history and military strategy as these separate academic subjects.
Like they're isolated in their own university departments.
Exactly. But in reality, they are a single, continuous ecosystem. You cannot pull on one thread without making the whole web vibrate.
That is such a good way to put it. So let's start by looking at the tangible things on that receipt first. The obvious heavyweights of American exports.
Right, because we need to build a sense of scale here.
Yeah, the sheer volume of what the United States sends out into the world is just staggering. And when we talk about physical goods, I mean, the variety alone is fascinating.
It's totally unique. Usually a country has one or two primary things it does well.
Right, like a nation might be incredible at exporting electronics, or they might be a massive exporter of crude oil, but rarely both.
But the American export portfolio, at least according to the data we have in front of us, is just uniquely diversified.
Let's look at energy. We are talking refined petroleum, crude oil, and this massive, unprecedented surge in liquefied natural gas, or LNG.
And the LNG narrative is actually a perfect example of how physical exports immediately bleed into geopolitical power.
Oh, absolutely.
Just think about what happened following the Russia-Ukraine disruptions.
Yeah.
Before that conflict, Europe was, heavily reliant on Russian natural gas flowing through pipelines.
Which was a massive strategic vulnerability for them.
A huge one. So when that supply was disrupted, Europe was staring down an existential energy crisis. I mean, they literally needed fuel to keep the power grid from failing during the winter.
And the U.S. essentially stepped in to fill that void.
Right. The U.S. transformed into one of the world's largest LNG exporters almost overnight. So we aren't just talking about selling a commodity here. We're talking about keeping an entire continent's lights on.
And the logistics of that are just wild. They have to supercool the natural gas until it turns into a liquid, right?
Yep, down to roughly negative 260 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow. And then pump it onto these specialized ships, sail it across the Atlantic, and then warm it back up into a gas. It's just an incredible feat of engineering.
It really is.
But it doesn't stop at energy. Moving down the receipt, you hit manufacturing and tech. You've got civilian aircraft and aerospace equipment led by Boeing.
Right, exporting commercial airliners and highly complex aerospace components. It's a hugely high-value category.
And right alongside that, you have the digital brainpower, semiconductors, and tech components.
Companies like Intel and NVIDIA.
Exactly. They're shipping out the microchips and AI processors that basically serve as the neural network for the modern world's high-performance computing.
And notice the contrast there. You have the heavy legacy manufacturing of aircraft and automobiles from companies like Ford and General Motors, which remain a massive export bloc.
Oh yeah, totally massive.
But you pair that legacy manufacturing with the cutting-edge advanced manufacturing of AI processors. The U.S. economy is simultaneously exporting the physical transportation of the present and the digital infrastructure of the future.
That's a great point. And then you get to defense. The U.S. is the single largest arms exporter on the planet.
By a very wide margin.
Right. We're talking fighter jets like the F-35s, missile systems, drones, and naval systems heading to NATO allies, the Middle East, and Indo-Pacific partners. And I have to imagine exporting a fighter jet is very different from, say, exporting a shipment of soybeans.
Oh, radically different.
Yeah.
Defense exports are rarely just transactional.
How so?
Well, when a nation buys an advanced weapons system like an F-35, they aren't just buying a plane. They are buying into an entire ecosystem.
Right, because of all the upkeep.
Exactly. That jet requires highly specific maintenance, continuous software upgrades, and specialized pilot training that only the U.S. can provide.
Ah, I see.
So the purchasing nation is effectively integrating their own military infrastructure with American technology for the next 30 or 40 years.
Wow.
Yeah. A weapons export is a physical good that functions as a long-term geopolitical anchor. It binds the security interests of the buyer to the strategic interests of the seller.
That makes a lot of sense. It's basically a decades-long relationship masquerading as a sale.
Exactly.
And rounding out the massive physical and digital exports, our sources highlight agriculture and pharmaceuticals. I mean, the U.S. feeds a significant portion of the globe with soybeans, corn, and beef.
And on the medical side, you have global suppliers like Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson exporting prescription drugs and vaccines everywhere.
And finally, there's the cultural and digital services sector. Software, the Microsoft and Apple ecosystems, Hollywood films, financial services.
We are essentially exporting the digital and cultural environment that much of the world interacts with from the moment they wake up.
Yeah. So if you look at that portfolio, from raw calories and liquid energy to fighter jets and artificial intelligence, it is just a picture of absolute dominance.
It really is. And if you measure strictly by the dollar value of those physical goods and services, things like aircraft, machinery, and oil comfortably sit at the top of the ranks.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because here is the twist the sources throw at us. We just spent all this time listing an absolute empire of tangible assets.
Right.
But none of those is the #1 export. The true top export of the United States, the absolute heavyweight champion on that global receipt, is the United States dollar itself.
The U.S. dollar, acting as the global reserve currency. And this really requires us to completely reframe how we think about exports.
It does, because we are so conditioned to think of an export as something packed into a wooden crate or loaded onto a cargo ship.
Right. But a currency, when it is structured and leveraged in a highly specific way, functions as the most powerful financial export imaginable.
I am really trying to wrap my head around the actual mechanics of exporting a piece of paper. Or, well, I guess more accurately, a digital number on a screen. How do you export a dollar?
You export it by creating inescapable global demand for it. And the data here is incredibly telling.
Yeah, the numbers are wild.
Currently, roughly 58 to 60% of all global foreign exchange reserves are held in U.S. dollars.
Okay, let's break down foreign exchange reserves for the listener really quickly. That basically means other countries' central banks, like the Bank of Japan or the European Central Bank, are just sitting on giant vaults, whether digital or physical, full of American money.
That is exactly correct.
Wow.
And they hold those dollars because they are structurally obligated to. The majority of global trade settlements are conducted in U.S. dollars.
Right.
But most importantly, the vast majority of global oil trades are priced in U.S. dollars.
Okay, so how does that play out in the real world?
Well, imagine you are Japan. You have a massive industrial economy, but very few domestic energy resources.
Right, they have to import basically everything to keep the lights on.
Exactly. You need to buy millions of barrels of oil from Saudi Arabia just to keep your economy functioning.
Yep.
But you cannot pay Saudi Arabia in Japanese yen. Saudi Arabia does not want yen.
And Japan doesn't use Saudi reals.
Right. So you have to take your yen Go to the foreign exchange market, buy U.S. dollars, and then use those dollars to purchase the oil.
Okay, I was trying to come up with a way to visualize this level of control. It's sort of like a casino.
Ooh, that's a good way to look at it.
You walk in, and to play the blackjack tables or the slot machines, you have to trade your cash for their specific casino chips. That's a normal closed system.
Right. You play the games, you cash out, you leave.
But the US dollar is like a casino that doesn't just make you use their chips at the card tables. They have somehow convinced the entire surrounding town that you also have to use those casino chips at the local grocery store to buy gas and to pay your rent. The casino chips have basically become the oxygen of the town's entire economy.
That analogy perfectly captures the leverage involved. Because think about what happens to the casino in that scenario.
They hold all the cards, literally.
The casino suddenly holds immense, deeply disproportionate power over the entire town. If the entire population is dependent on those chips to survive, the casino can essentially print as many new chips as it wants without the value immediately collapsing.
Because in a normal environment, printing endless chips would make them worthless.
Exactly. But here, the demand is artificially high and practically infinite. Everyone needs the chips just to go about their daily lives.
Which really highlights a critical distinction the sources make. If you are just looking at a spreadsheet of physical dollar value, the machinery and the oil win.
Right.
But if you measure by global influence, the US dollar is America's most powerful export. It allows the US to finance its own national debt incredibly cheaply and exert unparalleled influence over global finance.
And consider what those foreign central banks actually do with all those surplus dollars they are forced to hold.
They don't just leave them sitting idle in a digital vault, do they?
No, they want to earn interest on them. So they use those dollars to buy U.S. Treasury bonds. They essentially loan the money back to the United States government.
Wow.
This constant, insatiable global demand for dollars and U.S. debt is what allows the American government to run deficits that would bankrupt almost any other nation on Earth. It is the invisible engine of American economic power.
The ability to essentially borrow money forever at lower interest rates, all because the rest of the world has no choice but to buy your debt.
That's the reality of the system.
But this raises a massive historical question. The dollar didn't just magically become the world's mandatory casino chip since the dawn of time.
It absolutely did not. And to understand how this system was engineered, we have to look back at a very specific moment of profound vulnerability for the U.S. economy.
We have to examine how a moment of crisis was actually transformed into a masterclass in geopolitical leverage. So let's pivot to the historical source material. We need to look at the birth of the petrodollar. But before we get to the highly secretive agreement in 1974, we have to talk about the crisis that triggered it in 1971, the Nixon shock.
Right. So prior to 1971, the global financial system operated under what was called the Bretton Woods Agreement.
Which was set up right after World War II, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to simplify a highly complex system, Bretton Woods fundamentally meant that the U.S. dollar was backed by physical gold.
Okay.
Other nations were willing to hold dollars because they treated them like a claim check. They knew that at any point, they could hand that dollar back to the United States and receive a fixed amount of physical gold in return. It provided a baseline of physical stability and trust.
So it's essentially a coat check. You give the U.S. your coat, which is your wealth, and they give you a little paper ticket, which is the dollar.
That's a great analogy.
And as long as you believe your coat is safely hanging in the back room, you are perfectly happy to trade that paper ticket around. But what happens when everyone shows up at the coat check at the exact same time and realizes there aren't enough coats?
Panic. Complete panic. And that is essentially what began happening in the late 1960s and early 1970s.
Yeah, the spending, right.
Yeah, the U.S. was spending massive amounts of money on the Vietnam War and domestic programs, printing more dollars than it had gold to back them.
Ah, okay.
So foreign nations started getting nervous and began demanding their gold. In 1971, President Richard Nixon unilaterally suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold.
He essentially closed the coat check.
He closed the coat check. And practically overnight, the dollar lost its foundational backing. It transitioned into a pure fiat currency.
Let's make sure we define that clearly for the listener. Fiat literally means let it be done, or by decree. A fiat currency has no intrinsic value. It isn't backed by gold or silver or anything physical. It only has value because the government says it does and because the people using it collectively believe in it.
And that transition to a fiat system created an immediate existential crisis of demand for the U.S. government.
I can imagine.
Because without the promise of gold, why would the rest of the world continue to hold and trade in U.S. dollars?
Right, there's no physical guarantee anymore.
Exactly. If foreign nations lost trust and started dumping their dollar reserves, the value of the currency would plummet, causing catastrophic inflation and economic collapse at home.
Which is terrifying.
The U.S. desperately needed a new anchor. They needed a way to guarantee that the rest of the world still required the dollar, even without the gold backing.
Well, if the dollar couldn't be backed by gold, what is the next most essential, universally required commodity on the planet?
Oil.
Oil. And here's where it gets really interesting. In 1974, U.S. officials engaged in a series of highly secretive negotiations with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
Very secretive.
Yeah, this wasn't something broadcast on the nightly news. It was a quiet, structural deal negotiated behind closed doors that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of human history.
The mechanics of this pact are elegantly simple but vastly powerful. It was an exchange of profound mutual benefit designed to solve critical problems for both nations.
So what was the offer?
The U.S. approached the Saudi royal family with an unprecedented offer. The United States military would provide a permanent umbrella of security.
It was full protection.
Full protection. The U.S. would guarantee the protection of the Saudi kingdom against regional adversaries, provide them with advanced military hardware, and ensure their ongoing stability.
That is a massive offer. I mean, the full weight of the American military-industrial complex acting as a shield for your country.
It's basically the ultimate insurance policy.
But in exchange for that protection, what did Saudi Arabia actually have to do? According to our sources, there were two primary conditions. First, Saudi Arabia agreed to price all of their oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars. They would not accept any other currency for their oil.
In a second.
Second, they agreed to take all the surplus dollars they were making from those oil sales and reinvest them straight back into U.S. Treasury bonds.
And the global ripple effect of that agreement simply cannot be overstated.
Yeah.
Because Saudi Arabia was, and frankly still is, the absolute heavyweight of OPEC.
The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries.
Right. Because Saudi Arabia produced so much oil and had so much influence within that group, once they agreed to this structure, the die was cast. By 1975, just a year later, the rest of the OPEC nations followed suit.
Wow, that fast.
That fast. The entire cartel began pricing their oil exclusively in U.S. dollars.
So let's look at what this actually did to the global board. Suddenly, the entire globe is forced into a corner.
Yep.
If you are a developing nation that wants to industrialize, if you want to keep your factories running, your supply chains moving, and your citizens from freezing in the winter, you need oil.
You absolutely have to have it.
And to get that oil, you are now legally and structurally required to acquire U.S. dollars.
It's brilliant, really.
The United States took a pure fiat currency running on nothing but trust and successfully linked it to the absolute baseline requirement for modern civilization.
And the academic sources use a very specific, crucial phrase to describe the result of this maneuver. They say it provided America with an exorbitant privilege.
Exorbitant privilege. I love how descriptive that is. But let's bring it down to the ground level. How does that privilege actually manifest in the real world for the U.S. economy?
It basically acts as an economic cheat code.
A cheat code.
Yeah, because every country on Earth is scrambling to acquire dollars to buy oil. The global demand for the dollar is artificially but permanently sustained. It effectively exported American inflation.
Oh, wow.
Furthermore, because Saudi Arabia and the other OPEC nations are taking the billions of dollars they make and using them to buy U.S. Treasury bonds, they are effectively lending all that money right back to the U.S. government.
It's a closed loop. We print the money out of thin air. They use that money to buy oil. The oil producers take the profit and lend it right back to us, which we then use to fund our government.
Exactly. This mechanism is known formally as petrodollar recycling.
Petrodollar recycling.
Yes, and it meant the United States could run massive budget deficits, spending far more than it took in through taxes, and it could finance that debt at incredibly low interest rates.
Because there was a guaranteed captive buyer for its bonds.
Right. It fundamentally altered the architecture of the U.S. economy, allowing for unprecedented military expansion and domestic spending without the immediate crushing inflationary consequences that would destroy a normal economy attempting the exact same thing.
It is genuinely stunning to step back and observe the entire mechanism. The dollar wasn't backed by gold anymore. It was backed by the global necessity of oil and the implied threat of the U.S. military ensuring that system stayed in place.
That's the foundation.
But if X is true, that the entire American economy, its standard of living, its ability to carry trillions in debt relies entirely on the whole world needing dollars to buy oil, then what happens when a leader tries to change the rules of the game?
That question leads us directly into a deeply complex analysis of American military interventions over the last few decades.
And we have to proceed really carefully here.
We do. The sources we are examining delve into rigorous academic and policy analysis, not political punditry.
Absolutely. To be totally clear with you listening, we are not taking a political side or endorsing a specific ideology. We are strictly unpacking the frameworks that scholars and geopolitical analysts use to understand the underlying mechanics of global conflicts.
Right, we are looking at the data they present regarding why nations project military force.
Exactly.
And the most rigorous academic analyses emphasize a convergence of factors. There is rarely, if ever, a single isolated reason a superpower goes to war.
It's never just one thing.
Never. It is an incredibly messy alchemy of geopolitical strategy, economic necessity, historical rivalries, and domestic politics. However, the sources highlight that a widely supported structural argument centers heavily on exactly what we've been discussing.
Maintaining the global hegemony of the US dollar.
Precisely.
Let's define hegemony really quick so we are all on the same page. Think of it like a homeowners association in a massive neighborhood. But one homeowner has the power to write the rules, enforce the rules, and when convenient, ignore the rules because they own the roads and the water supply.
That's a funny but actually very accurate way to put it.
Right. Hegemony is the political, economic, or military predominance of one state over others.
So under this academic framework, the primary driver for certain interventions is the defense of petrodollar hegemony and global stability.
Okay.
The argument posits that the U.S. dollar's strength relies entirely on its status as the primary currency for international trade.
And oil specifically.
And oil. If major oil-producing nations suddenly decided to bypass the dollar, say, by selling their oil for euros or for Chinese yuan or even a gold-backed currency, the global demand for the dollar would immediately begin to drop.
And if demand drops significantly, the value of the dollar drops? The exorbitant privilege evaporates?
It vanishes.
If trillions of dollars currently held overseas suddenly aren't needed to buy oil, they could come flooding back into the United States, triggering massive hyperinflation.
It would be an economic disaster.
The U.S. would face immense difficulty financing its debt. The stakes are literally existential for the American economic model as it exists today.
Therefore, under this lens, military interventions are often perceived by analysts as attempts to maintain this structural hegemony. If a foreign leader threatens to sell oil and alternative currencies, they transition from being a mere political nuisance to a structural threat to the entire U.S. economy. The sources specifically point to Iraq, pre-2003, and Libya in 2011 as case studies where this dynamic was intensely relevant.
What happened there exactly?
In both instances, there were well-documented public movements by their leaders to shift oil sales away from the dollar.
Oh, really?
Yes. Saddam Hussein was explicitly moving to price Iraqi oil in euros, and Muammar Gaddafi was pushing for a Pan-African gold dinar.
It's vital to clarify how this works mechanically, though, because when people hear this theory, they often picture soldiers literally rolling in with tanks to siphon crude oil out of the desert to steal it.
Right, they imagine actual theft.
Yeah, you hear the popular protest slogan, "No blood for oil," and that slogan resonates emotionally. But the reality described in our sources is much more sophisticated than that.
It is about systemic control, not petty theft. The goal of an intervention, according to this analysis, is to ensure the system remains intact.
The system itself.
Exactly. To ensure that whoever happened to be extracting and selling the oil continues to price it in U.S. dollars, thereby sustaining the high deficit system the U.S. relies on.
Got it.
It's about securing reliable access to energy for the global economy, which acts as a foundational bulwark for U.S. economic power.
Right, because if a hostile power controls a massive percentage of the world's oil, they don't even have to change the currency to cause chaos. They can simply restrict the flow.
Just turn the tap off.
Yeah, and if they shut off the spigot, it causes massive price spikes. Those spikes act like a devastating tax on the entire global economy, triggering recessions.
Which hurts the U.S. directly.
The Gulf War in the early 90s, responding to the invasion of Kuwait, is cited here as an example of preventing a hostile actor from monopolizing the energy market and holding the global economy hostage.
But as the sources note, This complex economic and strategic rationale protecting the currency mechanism and stabilizing global energy markets is rarely the official public justification for military action.
No, you never hear a politician get up and say we need to protect the bond market.
Exactly. When a government addresses its citizens or the United Nations to announce an intervention, the narrative almost always centers on humanitarian concerns, stopping atrocities, preventing genocide, or removing a dictator who is harming their own people.
And to be clear, the atrocities committed by these regimes are often horrifyingly real.
Oh, absolutely real.
But the academic critics cited in our sources point out a profound statistically measurable inconsistency.
You're right.
Research indicates that the United States is mathematically far more likely to intervene in a nation if it is an oil-producing state, even if there are regions elsewhere in the world experiencing significantly worse human rights abuses where no intervention occurs.
And critics of this dynamic argue that while the moral imperative is emphasized to build domestic and international consensus for a war, it effectively acts as a mask for the underlying structural and economic goals.
They refer to this framing as a tool of imperialism, used to justify actions primarily rooted in maintaining the petrodollar system and controlling energy flows.
Which is a heavy accusation.
Okay, I have to stop and really examine this because it feels like we are drifting into dangerous territory.
How so?
Well, when you lay the narrative out like the secret 1974 deal, the absolute reliance on the dollar, the pattern of invading oil-producing nations precisely when they threaten to use euros or gold, it sounds incredibly neat.
It does.
It sounds like the plot of a geopolitical thriller where a cabal of bankers is pulling strings in a smoke-filled room. How much of this is rigorous analysis and how much is just a grand conspiracy theory?
It is an essential distinction to make. What you're describing is often called the petrodollar warfare theory.
Right.
And it posits an absolute, rigid, almost mechanical rule. Any country trying to bypass the dollar in oil sales is automatically and instantly targeted by the CIA or the military for regime change.
Right. It implies a perfect one-to-one correlation that totally ignores everything else happening in the world.
And that is exactly where the theory falls apart upon closer inspection. Is there a strong statistical correlation between oil-rich nations with non-dollar currencies and U.S. military intervention?
There is.
Yes. The historical data supports that correlation. However, the strict conspiracy theory is simply too neat. It willfully ignores the immense, chaotic complexity of geopolitics.
So how does reality complicate the conspiracy? What are the other factors disrupting this neat narrative?
Time and pre-existing conditions. Almost without exception, the nations that attempted to move away from the petrodollar were already deep, intractable geopolitical rivals of the United States long before any currency disputes arose.
Oh, interesting.
Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi were not peaceful U.S. allies who suddenly fell out of favor solely because they mentioned a new currency at a banking conference.
Right. They weren't just innocent bankers.
Exactly. They were already designated as rogue states. They were engaged in activities that threatened U.S. regional allies, pursuing weapons program, or actively sponsoring regional terrorism.
So a leader deciding to drop the dollar might actually be a symptom of their hostility toward the U.S. rather than the singular inciting cause of a war.
Exactly.
It's a way for a hostile nation to poke the bear, knowing it will hurt the U.S. economy.
Precisely. Furthermore, there are massive, constant strategic factors at play that have nothing to do with currency. Maintaining regional stability is paramount.
Sure.
Protecting established allies in the Middle East, ensuring the safety of global shipping lanes, and increasingly, the broader geopolitical competition with peer rivals like China and Russia.
Ah, right.
If the U.S. leaves a power vacuum in a resource-rich region, Beijing or Moscow will inevitably fill it. That is a massive strategic threat, independent of what currency is used to buy oil.
It's a multi-dimensional chess game on a board where the squares are constantly shifting. Let's synthesize this. Based on the totality of the academic and historical sources we've unpacked, what is the ultimate overarching motive for these actions?
The ultimate motive synthesizing all these competing perspectives is the preservation of hegemony.
The preservation of hegemony.
Yes. The United States acts fundamentally to maintain its position as the leading global power. That hegemony is supported by a foundational structure. controlling access to global energy resources, maintaining the unipolar dominance of the US dollar, and preventing any peer rivals from rising to a position where they can dictate the rules of the international system.
Right.
Humanitarian concerns, while often genuinely felt by the public and many policymakers, frequently serve as the publicly palatable justification for decisions that are structurally rooted in maintaining that overarching power dynamic.
So what does this all mean for us today? If this petrodollar system has essentially run the world since that secret handshake in the desert in 1974, where do we stand right now?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because looking at the news, it doesn't feel like the system is as unquestioned or as stable as it was in the 1990s.
You are sensing a very real tectonic shift in global finance. The final pieces of our source material detail what is happening at this exact moment. The unraveling.
The unraveling.
Yes. The petrodollar system is currently experiencing a slow structural erosion.
Well, if the system was built in a foundational deal with Saudi Arabia, it makes logical sense that the unraveling would start there too, right?
It does.
And the sources point to a massive recent development. Saudi Arabia joining BRICS. Let's explain what BRICS actually is and how it functions as a counterweight.
Okay, so BRICS is an intergovernmental organization originally comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
Hence the acronym.
Right. But recently, they have expanded to include several other nations, notably Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE.
Wow, so it's growing.
It is. It functions essentially as a geopolitical and economic bloc, forming a direct counterweight to Western U.S.-led institutions like the IMF and the World Bank.
I see.
Many of these nations are looking at the way the U.S. uses the dollar system, specifically the ability to levy devastating economic sanctions against countries like Russia, and they're realizing that reliance on the dollar is a massive strategic vulnerability.
And the biggest shockwave here, according to the data, is that Saudi Arabia is explicitly exploring non-dollar oil settlements.
Yes, they are.
They are actively looking at pricing and selling oil using the Chinese yuan. That feels like a direct structural violation of the 1974 pact we spent so much time discussing.
It is a profound pivot. When the original architect of the petrodollar system begins testing the waters with the currency of America's primary geopolitical and economic rival, it signals that the era of absolute unipolar dollar dominance is beginning to end.
That is huge.
However, the sources provide a very important caveat here regarding the speed of this transition.
Right, we aren't looking at a sudden apocalyptic collapse of the dollar where it becomes worthless paper tomorrow.
Correct. It's not a cliff edge. It is a slow, gradual, incredibly complex shift toward a multipolar currency world.
Why is it so slow?
Because the US dollar is so deeply structurally embedded in global trade, global debt markets, and global institutions that you cannot simply unplug it overnight. Attempting to do so would trigger a catastrophic collapse of the entire global economy, which would hurt China and Saudi Arabia just as much as it would hurt the United States.
Oh, because they hold so much of our debt.
Exactly. They all hold trillions in U.S. debt. They don't want to burn down the house. They just want to build a new one next door.
Okay, so we are looking at a slow generational transition. But how does this impact the listener? If this is a slow erosion happening at the highest, most abstract levels of global finance, why should the everyday person care?
Because it directly impacts the foundational purchasing power of your life.
Explain that.
As the structural, mandatory global demand for the U.S. dollar slowly declines, as more countries trade in yuan or rupees, the exorbitant privilege we discussed begins to shrink. The U.S. will find it increasingly difficult and expensive to finance its massive national debt.
Which means the government has to offer higher interest rates to convince people to buy that debt.
Yes.
And when interest rates go up, it becomes more expensive for the listener to get a mortgage, to buy a car, or to start a business. It can lead to persistent inflation, a general tightening of the American economy, and a lower standard of living. It hits your wallet directly.
Precisely. And the sources note that global investors and central banks are already reacting to this structural shift.
What are they doing?
As the foundation of the fiat dollar system shows cracks, smart money is looking backward to find stability. There is a heavily documented pivot toward physical commodities.
Like what?
Gold is seeing a massive resurgence. Central banks around the world are hoarding and stockpiling physical gold at record rates, attempting to hedge their bets against the slow decline of the dollar's global monopoly.
It is a fascinating historical rhyme. In 1971, the world left the physical anchor of gold for a fiat currency anchored by oil.
Right.
Now, half a century later, as that fiat oil alliance begins to fracture, the world is slowly turning its eyes back toward gold and tangible assets. It is a fundamental restructuring of global trust.
It really is an incredible cycle to watch.
This has been an incredible journey through the sources today. We started by looking at the tangible exports that shape the American economy. The massive fields of soybeans, the assembly lines churning out fighter jets, the logistics of liquid natural gas.
But we quickly realize that the true power lies in the invisible.
The invisible architecture of global finance, the U.S. dollar acting as a weaponized financial export sustained by a secretive handshake in the desert in 1974.
And we traced how protecting that invisible architecture has shaped a half-century of geopolitical strategy and global interventions.
Yeah, it is a deeply complex web of economic necessity, energy control, and geopolitical rivalry that often hides behind much simpler, more palatable public narratives.
Very true.
And as we look to the future, as that architecture begins its slow, multipolar unraveling through organizations like BRICS, it leaves us facing a vastly different global landscape.
Which forces us to ask what the new foundational structure will be. If the old system is fading, what replaces it?
That brings us to a final thought for you to mull over as we wrap up. We've spent this entire deep dive looking at the past 50 years, an era almost entirely defined by the flow of crude oil and the U.S. dollars used to buy it.
Right.
But think back to the export list we started with at the very beginning of the show. The fastest growing, most cutting-edge sectors weren't crude oil. They were advanced manufacturing, semiconductors, AI processors.
This raises a critical, paradigm-shifting question. If the global conflicts and financial systems of the 20th and early 21st centuries were engineered to control the flow of oil, what will define the next 50 years?
As the world transitions toward renewable energy grids, electric vehicles, and artificial intelligence, the new oil isn't liquid at all.
No, it's not.
It's the rare earth minerals required to build those microchips. It's the physical infrastructure of the digital grid: lithium, cobalt, silicon. So who will control the currency of the futures grid?
It's a huge question.
Will we see a new invisible pact struck in a closed room, this time over silicon and lithium instead of crude oil? Will there be a silicon dollar or a lithium yuan?
It requires a completely new paradigm of strategic thinking. The nations that can secure the physical supply chains for the next generation of technology will be the ones who dictate the terms of the next global currency system.
So the game remains the same.
The game remains exactly the same, only the board and the pieces are changing.
That is something to think about the next time you look at a receipt, or fill up your gas tank, or upgrade your smartphone. The invisible architecture is always shifting beneath our feet, dictating the reality we experience. Keep questioning the structure of the world around you. Thank you for joining us in the lounge. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.
Transmission live. Global system online. Currency is control.
Bringing the power round and round, moving the world without a sound. Stacking the chips, the best go down. Who runs the game? The dollar now. Bringing the power, can you see? Locked in the code of economy. Playing the game of currency. The house don't lose, it holds the key. Not made of steel, not made of grain. Not built in factories or trains. It moves in silence, flows insane. A paper ghost, a global machine. You wonder or you pay the fee. Denominated USD. Across the world, the same demand. You need the dollar to make a stand. Round the table, place your bet. Global player, deep in debt. Stack it higher, don't forget. The house collect, the house collect. Printing the power, round and round. Moving the world, without a sound. Stacking the chips, let's go down. Who is the game? The dollar now. 71 to go cut loose. But still the system found its use. There's a deal, the oil flow. Price it in dollars, everybody know. Black gold spins the roulette wheel. Energy locked in a paper deal. You need to fuel sign? Who sets a price? The dollar does. Who runs a trade? Because it was. Who holds the debt? The system's trust. Who breaks away? You pay the cost. Not just war, but rules of play. Change the currency, there's hell to pay. Market shifting, leaders fall. Was it freedom or protocol? Weapons, chips, and silver screens. Build a world behind the scenes. Culture flows and data streams. Tired all the dollar dreams. Winning the power. Watch it spin. Bet on a house. You play to win. Stacking the world. Chip by chip. One wrong move and the tables flip. Printing the power. Feel the strain. Cracks in the system. Shifting lane. New place there. Into the light. Changing the odds. Rewriting the night.
System. Fragment. New currencies detected. Game status uncertain.
Round and round, the wheel don't stop till the system starts to drop. Place your bets, take your stance. Welcome to the global game of change.